The heat pressed down like a weight on Marcus Grant's shoulders as he stood at his post outside St. James Palace. In his crisp, red ceremonial uniform and tall bearskin cap, he embodied the tradition and poise of the Royal Guard, a sight that drew thousands of visitors each year. It was a position he trained for relentlessly, pushing through grueling tests of discipline and fortitude. Though it looked glamorous to outsiders, Marcus knew the hours of standing still could turn any day into a battle of mental and physical endurance. Today, with the sun pounding down mercilessly, was no exception. Beads of sweat trickled down his neck, but he resisted every urge to shift or wipe his brow. The changing of the guard ceremony had started, and his duty was to stay motionless, a pillar of tradition. The tourists packed close to the palace gates, their faces alight with awe as the band played its timeless anthem, filling the air with a melody that resonated with history and pride. Children on their parents' shoulders squealed in delight. Couples whispered to each other as they marveled at the guard's unflinching discipline, and visitors from around the world raised their phones, hoping to capture the grandeur of the palace against the soldiers' rigid forms. Marcus allowed himself a quiet pride in this spectacle, thinking of the years of service he'd given to reach this point. Every salute, every step, every motion he made was a tribute to the discipline of the Royal Guard. He knew that his presence in the palace meant something more. As one of the few black guards, he felt the eyes of the crowd linger on him just a little longer, and he understood why. His very existence in the role represented a changing Britain, a nod to inclusivity that wasn't often acknowledged in these old walls. He glanced at the guards marching in flawless unison, their boots clicking in rhythm. But before he could immerse himself in the familiar sounds of the ceremony, his focus was shattered by an icy voice that broke through the crowd's gentle murmur. "Hey you, the black one, how about a smile for the camera?" The words were unmistakable and unmistakably aimed at him. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd been trained for this. His gaze remained steady as he looked out over the crowd, his face an impassive mask. The woman who'd called to him was a tall, blonde tourist near the gate. She wore expensive-looking sunglasses and a smirk that told Marcus she wasn't simply a casual sightseer. She was looking for something more. In one hand, she held her phone high, the camera pointed at his face, waiting for a reaction. "Are you going to ignore me?" she continued, her voice carrying a sharp, mocking tone. "What's the matter? Can't you understand English?" The laughter of a few nearby tourists joined hers, but Marcus remained motionless, his grip tightening on the hilt of his bayonet. He knew people like her, those who came to gawk at the guards and poke at their resolve just to see if they'd break. Over the years, he'd learned to tune out the taunts, to see the people but not hear them. But today, her words wormed their way into his mind. "What's with all this diversity anyway?" the woman sneered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Don't they have enough of you back where you came from?" A few onlookers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. A group of tourists near her laughed nervously, unsure whether to join in or ignore her. Marcus could feel his pulse hammering beneath his skin, each beat of his heart echoing in his chest like the drums that marked the guard's march. He tried to focus on his breathing, inhaling slowly to calm himself. It was a technique he'd learned to control his nerves on days like these, days when patience seemed as thin as a stretched wire. The woman's young nephew, a boy of about 8 or 9, tugged on her arm, his wide eyes fixed on Marcus. "Aunt Emma, why's he standing so still?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine curiosity. "Is he a statue?" Emma chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's about all he's good for, isn't it?" She laughed, flashing Marcus a look that suggested he was nothing more than a spectacle, something less than human. The boy continued to stare at Marcus, his gaze unblinking. "Why doesn't he talk?" "Can he talk, Aunt Emma?" Emma gave him a condescending pat on the head. "Oh, honey, it's just because he's not from around here. Probably doesn't even understand us," she said loudly, making sure the words would reach Marcus's ears. The heat of the day grew thicker, pressing down on him like a physical weight. A small crowd began to gather, curiosity piqued by Emma's mocking taunts. They watched, waiting for Marcus to respond, to break his silence. But Marcus knew he couldn't. His entire career, his hard-won dignity, rested on his ability to stay calm, to remain as immovable as the palace walls behind him. Then, Emma took a step closer, her face barely a foot from his. She cocked her head, her voice dropping to a taunting whisper that only he could hear. "Are you even capable of standing up for yourself? Or are you just another puppet?" He felt the taunt land like a blow to his gut, and he fought to keep his face expressionless. But something about her words, her brazen, unapologetic disdain, shook him to the core. This wasn't just mockery. It was an outright challenge to his very identity. She reached out as if to touch his uniform, and Marcus's hand instinctively tightened on his bayonet. He knew the rules. He knew the line he couldn't cross. But at that moment, the restraint felt almost unbearable. From the back of the crowd, a voice cut through, sharp and authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the guard." A security officer approached, his face set in a stern expression. He was a middle-aged man, his demeanor calm but firm. "These guards are here to perform a duty, not to entertain tourists," he continued. "Please respect their space." Emma scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, come on. It's just a bit of fun. They're supposed to be here for us to take pictures, aren't they?" "Ma'am." The officer's voice was now firm, his eyes unyielding. "Step back." With a huff of irritation, Emma backed away, tugging Tommy along with her. The crowd around them dispersed slowly, a few people casting glances of sympathy at Marcus as they went on with their day. Marcus remained still, his posture unwavering. Yet inside, he felt the weight of her words linger. He was relieved, but there was something about the interaction that left him uneasy, the challenge she'd posed gnawing at his mind. As the last notes of the band's anthem faded into silence, Marcus held his position, standing tall in the quiet aftermath. He knew this would not be the last time he faced such challenges. But as he resumed his duties with renewed resolve, he reminded himself that he stood there not just for himself, but for something far larger than one cruel woman's prejudice. The changing of the guard ended, and Marcus watched the tourists drift away, their attention wandering to other sights. Yet, as the evening shadows began to cast over the palace, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day, this moment, would lead to something he hadn't expected. The morning after the incident, Marcus was still thinking about the woman's sneering taunts as he prepared for his next shift at St. James Palace. It wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice in his role, but her words had been particularly piercing. The words, "Are you even capable of standing up for yourself? Or are you just another puppet?" echoed in his mind. They had been spoken with such venom and audacity, and the memory of them left a dull ache inside him. It was early, and the streets were still waking up as Marcus walked through central London, his uniform pressed and spotless, his posture upright and deliberate. To those who passed him, he looked as though he'd stepped right out of a photograph, strong, disciplined, unwavering. But inside, a storm was brewing, one that he couldn't afford to let spill over. He reached the palace and joined the other guards who were standing in a quiet line, waiting for the day's briefing. Captain Edward Price, his commanding officer, paced in front of them, his posture as rigid as the guards he commanded. Captain Price was a man who valued order above all else, a veteran who expected absolute adherence to tradition. Marcus respected him. He was a fair leader, but he was also uncompromising. The morning after the incident, Marcus was still thinking about the woman's sneering taunts as he prepared for his next shift at St. James Palace. It wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice in his role, but her words had been particularly piercing. The words, "Are you even capable of standing up for yourself? Or are you just another puppet?" echoed in his mind. They had been spoken with such venom and audacity, and the memory of them left a dull ache inside him. It was early, and the streets were still waking up as Marcus walked through central London, his uniform pressed and spotless, his posture upright and deliberate. To those who passed him, he looked as though he'd stepped right out of a photograph, strong, disciplined, unwavering. But inside, a storm was brewing, one that he couldn't afford to let spill over. He reached the palace and joined the other guards who were standing in a quiet line, waiting for the day's briefing. Captain Edward Price, his commanding officer, paced in front of them, his posture as rigid as the guards he commanded. Captain Price was a man who valued order above all else, a veteran who expected absolute adherence to tradition. Marcus respected him. He was a fair leader, but he was also uncompromising. "Gentlemen, remember that this position demands absolute professionalism," Captain Price said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You are symbols, each and every one of you. The country looks to you to uphold this legacy. There will always be those who test you, who challenge your patience, but you must hold steady." Marcus straightened, feeling the weight of his own responsibility settle over him. He took these words to heart, trying to brush away the lingering bitterness from yesterday. His job was to be unbreakable, to remain as resolute as the palace walls themselves. But no amount of mental preparation could have readied him for what lay ahead that day. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and already the crowd of tourists was swelling along the gate, phones and cameras in hand, eagerly waiting to capture the guard's movements. Marcus took his place at his assigned post, standing at attention with his head held high, his expression blank and focused. But as he surveyed the faces in the crowd, he felt a jolt of irritation when he saw her again. Emma, the blonde woman from yesterday. She was positioned near the front of the group, this time without her nephew, her gaze locked on him, a smirk curling at the corner of her mouth. It was as though she had come back just to finish what she'd started. "Didn't think I'd see you again," she sneered, loud enough to catch the attention of those around her. Her eyes gleamed with a kind of smug satisfaction, as though his presence alone justified her return. Marcus steadied his breathing, focusing his gaze somewhere beyond her, as though she didn't exist. But Emma wasn't one to be ignored. "What's wrong, soldier? Too proud to say hello?" she taunted, her voice dripping with mockery. "I thought the guards were supposed to be friendly to the tourists." A few people in the crowd chuckled uncomfortably, but some exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly, she was drawing attention, and some of the tourists had started to whisper, their curiosity piqued by her boldness. "Is he even allowed to be a guard?" Emma asked loudly, addressing the crowd. "Shouldn't the royal guard be, truly British?" This time, the discomfort among the crowd was palpable. Some visitors shuffled their feet, avoiding her gaze, while others looked at Marcus with what he could only describe as pity. He despised that look. He didn't want anyone's pity. He wanted respect, and he'd earned it, every bit of it. But her words were like barbs, poking at the pride he'd fought so hard to build. Still, he kept his stance, unblinking, his expression a mask of calm. "Look at him, standing there like a statue," she continued, her voice thick with derision. "Come on, don't you have anything to say for yourself? Can you even understand me?" She was so close now that he could smell the faint scent of perfume. Her face twisted into a smirk, her tone condescending as she spoke directly to him. "What's it like, I wonder, standing here all day, pretending to be something you're not?" Inside, Marcus felt a flame flickering, the anger simmering beneath his steady surface. He thought about how he'd trained for years, how he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with the other guards through countless grueling drills, how he'd endured more than most to be here. And now this woman, a stranger, was trying to reduce his role, his pride, and his achievements to nothing with her poisoned words. But he knew better than to react. He held his ground, remembering Captain Price's words, "You must hold steady." A young man standing near Emma cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. "Ma'am, maybe you should leave him alone. He's doing his job," he said, his voice respectful yet firm. Emma turned on him with a look of annoyance. "Mind your own business," she snapped. "He's supposed to be here for our entertainment, isn't he?" The man shook his head, backing away, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. Just then, Marcus noticed a palace security officer approaching from the side, his posture tense, his expression wary as he took in the scene. But before he could reach them, Emma pulled one last move. She lifted her hand as if to wave it in Marcus's face, hoping to provoke him with a cheap taunt. Without thinking, Marcus's hand twitched, just a small movement, but it was enough. Emma's face lit up with a victorious sneer, a look that made his stomach turn. "Oh, did I get to you? Maybe you're not so disciplined after all, she said, her voice low, taunting. But before she could push further, the security officer finally reached them, his tone cold and unyielding. "Ma'am, you're going to have to step back," he said, gesturing for her to move away from Marcus. "Your behavior is causing a disturbance, and I will ask you to respect the guard's space." Emma rolled her eyes, but, this time, took a step back. She looked up at Marcus, her expression twisting into something almost sinister. "I'll be back, soldier. Count on it." She turned and walked away, her head held high, but Marcus could see the glares of disapproval from those around her, the murmured comments from the crowd. Yet, a feeling of unease settled over him as he watched her go. It wasn't over, and he knew it. She'd be back. As the day went on, Marcus replayed the scene in his mind, the way she chipped away at him, the way her words had burned, and the way his own hand had betrayed him with that almost imperceptible twitch. That slight movement felt like a betrayal, not of himself, but of the principles he'd worked so hard to uphold. He had nearly broken protocol. Nearly. And it was that nearly that gnawed at him. When his shift ended, he was drained, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions he couldn't fully process. He felt a strange mixture of shame and anger as he walked back to his quarters, thinking about how easily someone like her had managed to nearly shake his resolve. But as he walked, he made himself a quiet promise. He would not let her words define him. He would not allow her to dismantle the years of hard work, the pride he'd built up within himself. He would hold his ground. In his room that night, as he lay on his bed staring up at the ceiling, Marcus thought about his journey to this position, about the sacrifices he'd made and the legacy he wanted to carry forward. He wasn't just standing there as a symbol. He was a symbol, and he would not allow her, or anyone else, to strip that away. As he drifted into sleep, he resolved to return to his post tomorrow with his head held high, as strong and unbreakable as the walls of the palace itself. The next day, Marcus braced himself as he arrived at St. James' Palace for his shift, his mind hardened with resolve. He had already accepted that Emma might return, and he was prepared. He would not let her, or anyone else, make him falter. The summer sun climbed higher as the changing of the guard ceremony began. Marcus took his place at the east gate, standing as straight as the palace walls, his face a mask of stoic determination. The band played, and the tourists gathered, their cameras raised as they documented the procession, the clicks and whirs mingling with the distant murmur of voices. Then, as if on cue, he spotted her, Emma. She stood among the crowd, a smirk already forming on her face as she caught sight of him. She was alone again, her posture just as haughty as the day before, and this time, her gaze held an almost predatory gleam. Emma moved closer to the gate, pushing her way through the tourists with an air of entitlement that turned a few heads. People were already whispering, their faces reflecting the mix of discomfort and fascination that Marcus knew all too well. They seemed to sense the tension in the air, a taut wire stretched between them, waiting to snap. Well, Emma began, her voice a mockingly sweet lilt as she leaned in. "Look who's back, standing still like the good little statue he is. Can't even look at me, can you?" Her taunts were sharper this time, each word a razor-edged challenge. Marcus's mind replayed Captain Price's words from the previous day. "You must hold steady." He clenched his jaw, willing himself to remain unaffected, to let her words fall away like rain on armor. But she pressed on, louder this time. "What's wrong, soldier? Afraid to speak up? Or maybe you're just too good at pretending. Isn't that all you people do anyway?" A few nearby tourists gasped, shifting uncomfortably. Some backed away, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. But others stayed, drawn by the spectacle she was making of herself, their curiosity overriding their discomfort. "Come on, give us a smile," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't they teach you that in whatever place you're from?" Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. He knew he had to stay calm. He repeated the mantra in his head, hold steady, hold steady. But Emma wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her face inches from his, her tone dropping to a mocking whisper. "Do you even belong here, standing in this uniform, pretending you're one of them?" His grip on his rifle tightened, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. He knew she was trying to provoke him, to break his silence, to make him lash out so she could paint him as the villain. And yet, no amount of training, no stoic resolve could erase the sting of her words, the deeply personal jab at his very identity. For the first time, he felt his composure waver. Her words weren't just taunts. They were an attack on everything he was, everything he'd worked so hard to build. They were an attempt to strip him of his dignity, to reduce him to something less than human. The sun was scorching, its heat only intensifying the feeling of being cornered, of being unable to escape her piercing, condescending gaze. Sweat trickled down his back, but he didn't dare move. Every muscle in his body was tense, a testament to his internal battle for control. Then, with one swift motion, she did the unthinkable. Emma reached up, her hand raised, and slapped him across the face. The crowd gasped in unison, the sound a wave of shock that rippled through the onlookers. For a split second, Marcus's mind went blank, the sting of her hand a burning imprint on his cheek. The silence was absolute, a stillness that stretched for what felt like an eternity. In that moment, something inside him snapped. His entire career, his years of training, every principle he'd held close, all of it seemed to crumble under the weight of that single slap. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, each beat reverberating with a fury he'd never felt before. Before he even realized it, Marcus's head turned, and his eyes locked onto hers. He didn't break protocol. He didn't move from his position. But his gaze was no longer passive. It was a glare, fierce and unyielding, that bore straight into her, communicating a message that words couldn't convey. Emma's face paled, her smirk evaporating as she took a step back, momentarily shaken by the intensity of his stare. But as quickly as her fear surfaced, she masked it with a look of defiance, her lips twisting into a sneer as she looked around the crowd, searching for validation. "Oh, come on," she laughed nervously, though her voice wavered. "What's he going to do? He's just a guard." But the crowd wasn't laughing. They were silent, their expressions filled with disapproval, some even with outrage. A few onlookers began muttering, the words disgraceful and out of line drifting through the air. And then, a voice rang out, louder and angrier than the rest. "Leave him alone." A man stepped forward from the crowd, his face red with indignation. "What's wrong with you? He's here to protect this place, not to be harassed by people like you." A few others nodded, murmuring in agreement, and Emma's confidence faltered. She glanced around, visibly uncomfortable, but tried to mask it with a scoff. "Seriously?" she sneered, but the conviction had faded from her voice. "It was just a slap. He's fine. Look, he didn't even flinch." A nearby woman crossed her arms, shaking her head. "That's no excuse. You crossed a line, and you know it." The tension in the air had shifted, the crowd turning against her, their gazes cold and disapproving. Even the security officers, who had initially hung back to watch, were now moving closer, their expressions hard as they surveyed the scene. The officer from yesterday approached, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." Emma looked around, desperation flickering in her eyes. She opened her mouth to protest, but the expressions around her left no room for sympathy. She glared at Marcus one last time, a flash of anger and embarrassment in her gaze. "This isn't over," she muttered, but her voice was barely a whisper, a final, bitter attempt to hold onto her fading sense of control. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the dispersing crowd. When she was gone, the tension began to dissipate, the air cooling as the crowd's murmurs softened. The security officer glanced at Marcus, his eyes filled with a silent respect. He gave a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement that Marcus understood immediately. Slowly, Marcus felt the anger ebbing, his heart rate returning to normal. He was still standing, still at his post, still unbroken. As the ceremony resumed, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had weathered the storm, faced her worst, and stood tall. She had thrown everything she could at him, and yet, here he was. By the end of his shift, When he finally left his post, he felt an odd lightness in his chest. He had held steady, and no matter what Emma, or anyone else, might say, he had won his own quiet battle. In his mind, he replayed the moment he'd stared her down, a small but powerful gesture that had sent a clear message. He was stronger than her hatred, and he was here to stay. Marcus walked into the barracks after his shift, his face still set in a calm expression, though his mind churned with thoughts of the day's events. He had expected hostility from Emma, but her slap had been a line he hadn't thought she'd cross. And though he hadn't moved or spoken, the way he'd stared her down, that one fierce look, was enough to leave him unsettled, questioning whether he'd overstepped. He wondered if his gaze had broken protocol, if he'd let his emotions slip through his otherwise impenetrable mask. The barracks were quiet, the other guards either asleep or on duty. He hadn't been back for more than a few minutes when he received a message summoning him to Captain Price's office. It was only early evening, but Marcus's stomach tightened, knowing this was anything but a routine meeting. He made his way through the stone corridors, his steps echoing in the silence. Outside Captain Price's office, he paused to steady himself, then knocked. The voice that responded was steady but held an edge of urgency. "Enter." Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside, standing at attention as he awaited whatever reprimand or lecture might follow. Captain Edward Price sat behind his desk, his posture rigid as always, but there was something new in his gaze, a mix of disappointment and tension. Captain Price was not a man who showed emotion easily, but Marcus could feel a restrained frustration in the air. "Sergeant Grant," he began, his voice steady but cold. "Take a seat." Marcus did as instructed, folding his hands in his lap, keeping his expression neutral. "You may have heard that there was some fallout from today's incident," Captain Price said, folding his hands in front of him on the desk. "The woman, Emma Wainwright, has filed a formal complaint against you. She claims you intimidated her, threatened her, claims that you looked as though you were ready to assault her." Marcus's jaw clenched, though he kept his face expressionless. He knew how ridiculous her words were, but he also understood that optics were everything. For someone in his position, even a look could be interpreted as aggression if someone wanted to see it that way. "Captain, with respect, I didn't move, speak, or break protocol," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "I stood my ground, as I was trained to do." Captain Price gave a curt nod, acknowledging Marcus's calmness, though his gaze remained hard. "I know you didn't break protocol, Sergeant, but this situation has grown complicated. Word of this has reached higher levels of command, and it's stirring up conversations we would rather avoid." The captain leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "She's making it seem as though you were deliberately hostile, that you singled her out for some kind of personal retaliation. Sir, with all due respect, she was the one who—" Marcus stopped himself, reining in his frustration, his voice returning to its disciplined calm. "She was the one provoking me, sir." Captain Price's mouth tightened, a flicker of sympathy briefly crossing his face. "I understand that, Grant. I've seen it before, the crowd heckling, testing. We've all endured it at one time or another." He paused, his eyes flicking over Marcus's face. "But you and I both know that, for you, it's been different." The words hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Marcus had long accepted that his presence in the Royal Guard was something of an anomaly, something that didn't sit comfortably with everyone. It was a truth he'd carried with him silently since his first day. The captain cleared his throat, looking away momentarily, as if gathering his thoughts. "This woman's complaint is a nuisance, to put it bluntly. However, we need to address it formally. Command has requested an inquiry." An inquiry. The word hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. His entire career could be at risk over a single look, a moment of anger he hadn't even expressed. He could feel his heart pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Understood, sir," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Captain Price studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "Grant, I know you're one of the most disciplined soldiers in this unit. I've never had cause to question your conduct before, and this complaint hasn't changed that. But I'm required to follow through with this, whether I believe it's fair or not." Marcus nodded, grateful for the captain's support, but he could feel a sinking feeling settling over him. A formal inquiry meant everything would be scrutinized, that his entire history, every shift he'd worked, every small move he'd made, could be picked apart. The inquiry will take place tomorrow. You'll be expected to recount the events, with all details you remember. Captain Price continued, his voice softer now, as if he understood the toll this would take. I'll be honest, Sergeant. This could go either way. But I believe in your character, and I'll support you as best I can. Thank you, sir, Marcus said, his voice quiet but resolute. He felt a glimmer of relief, knowing that Captain Price was behind him, even if only to a limited extent. As he stood to leave, Captain Price's voice stopped him. Grant, he said, and there was a flicker of something almost personal in his gaze. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the silent ones. Remember that. Marcus nodded, the weight of those words pressing into him. He left the office feeling heavier, the reality of what lay ahead settling over him like a dark cloud. That night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through the details of the day. He thought about the slap, the sting of it still fresh in his memory, and the anger that had flared up, almost out of control. He knew his gaze had been fierce, and he wondered if that single expression would cost him everything. For years, he had endured the silent, underhanded glances, the occasional sneers, the comments from those who couldn't accept his presence in the Royal Guard. He had learned to rise above it, to meet every test of patience with a stoic calm. But this time, it had been different. He'd felt that anger twist inside him, something raw and painful, and he hadn't been able to suppress it. Was he wrong to have felt that way? To have let her get to him? He didn't know anymore. All he knew was that he'd done his best to stand tall, to hold steady under fire. And now, it might not be enough. Sleep came reluctantly, filled with uneasy dreams, the faces of strangers in the crowd, Emma's mocking smirk, and Captain Price's watchful gaze all merging into a distorted blur. He awoke early, the dim light filtering through his window casting an eerie calm over his room. The inquiry room was plain, its walls bare and unwelcoming. Marcus sat at a long table across from a panel of officers, Captain Price included, who looked at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to indifference. The air was tense, charged with the weight of the unspoken judgments already forming. He recounted the events with precision, his voice steady as he detailed every moment of the confrontation. He described Emma's taunts, her intrusion into his space, the slap. But he left out his own internal struggle, the fury he'd fought to keep in check. That was his own battle, and he knew it would only harm him to reveal it. The officers listened in silence, their expressions unreadable as he finished. Captain Price finally broke the silence. Thank you, Sergeant Grant, he said, his voice neutral. The panel will review your account, and we'll be in touch with our decision soon. Marcus left the room, feeling drained, his nerves frayed from the relentless scrutiny. He had done everything he could, recounted the events honestly, and now all he could do was wait. The following day, he received a message from Captain Price summoning him back to his office. The hours between the inquiry and this moment had been agonizing, each one stretching out as he wrestled with doubts and fears he hadn't felt in years. When he entered Captain Price's office, the captain looked up, his face solemn but tinged with a faint relief. Sergeant Grant, the panel has reached its decision, he said, his voice calm. They've chosen not to pursue any disciplinary action. Your conduct was deemed professional, and the incident will be closed. Marcus felt a rush of relief, though he kept his face impassive. Thank you, sir. Captain Price nodded, his gaze softening slightly. You're free to resume your duties, Sergeant. But remember, we don't serve for ourselves. We serve for something larger, something that requires more than just strength. It requires restraint. Marcus nodded, the captain's words settling into him with a sense of finality. He understood now, more than ever, the true weight of his role. As he left the office, a quiet pride filled him. He had held steady, weathered the storm, and emerged with his integrity intact. But he also knew that his battle wasn't over. It would never be over. And as he walked out into the bright light of day, he braced himself, ready to face whatever came next. The relief Marcus felt after the inquiry was short-lived. Just as he was beginning to settle back into his duties, the incident took on a new life, one he had not anticipated. By the following day, a storm was brewing, not within the palace walls but outside them, in the public eye. He first noticed it when he arrived at the barracks early one morning and overheard a conversation among the other guards. Two of them stood near the entrance, murmuring in low voices, occasionally glancing his way with expressions of both sympathy and unease. "Did you see that article?" one of them whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "It's all over the papers. They're saying he glared at her, like he was about to lose it." "Can you blame him?" the other replied, shaking his head. "But still, this doesn't look good. They're calling it aggressive behavior." The words landed like a punch, but Marcus kept his face impassive as he walked past them. He'd been through enough to know that any reaction could only make things worse. But as he headed toward his post, a sense of dread crept over him. It didn't take long to confirm what he had overheard. As he was preparing his uniform, a young guard named Colin approached, his expression tight with worry. "Grant," he said, his tone cautious, "I thought you should know. It's everywhere. The tabloids, the news sites. That woman, the one from the incident, she's made a statement." Marcus's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression steady. "What kind of statement?" Colin shifted uncomfortably. "She's saying you intimidated her, that she felt unsafe and threatened. It's ugly. She's playing up the slap, saying you looked at her like you were going to attack her." Marcus felt a flash of anger, a familiar, unwelcome heat that he quickly suppressed. He couldn't afford to give in to it, not now. Instead, he took a deep breath, letting his gaze drift to the floor as he steadied himself. "I see," he said quietly, more to himself than to Colin. But Colin wasn't finished. "The story's been picked up by the tabloids. They're saying things like royal guard and racial clash with tourists. They're spinning it to make her look like the victim." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He'd known that the woman, Emma, had a sense of entitlement, but he hadn't anticipated that she'd go this far. Now, she was twisting the narrative, making herself look like an innocent tourist harassed by a hostile guard. And worse, she was using his background, his very identity, as ammunition. The gravity of the situation hit him like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was no longer just a guard who had managed to keep his cool under provocation. He was now part of a larger narrative, a narrative crafted by someone else, a story that twisted reality to fit a distorted version of events. Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. Headlines like "Tourist claims racial harassment by Royal Guard" and "Guard's intimidating stare leads to inquiry" splashed across news sites and social media. And while the palace had issued a brief statement supporting its guards' professionalism, the damage had been done. In public, Marcus maintained his composure, but inside, he felt himself being torn apart. He had spent years building his career, working tirelessly to uphold the dignity of the Royal Guard, only for his reputation to be tarnished overnight by a sensationalized story. The coverage had created a ripple effect, one that affected not only Marcus but also his colleagues. He could sense the shift in their behavior, the slight hesitations when they spoke to him, the sidelong glances, the guardedness that hadn't been there before. It all came to a head one morning when he overheard two guards talking just around the corner of the barracks. He paused, realizing he'd stepped into a conversation that wasn't meant for his ears. "I mean, what did he expect?" one of them muttered. "You're standing there in uniform, and you can't control your own face? Come on, don't act like you haven't thought it," the other replied, his voice a low rumble. "It's been tense ever since he got here. The crowd watches him differently, and he's just different." Marcus's heart sank, a mix of hurt and anger bubbling up inside him. He had always known that his presence was unusual, that he was one of only a few black guards in an institution steeped in tradition and, in some ways, resistance to change. He had thought he could earn respect through hard work, discipline, and dignity, but now he wondered if it would ever be enough. That evening, Captain Price called him into his office once again. Marcus took a deep breath before entering, mentally preparing himself for whatever conversation lay ahead. Captain Price looked up as he entered, his expression as stoic as always. but there was a glint of something sympathetic in his eyes. "Sergeant Grant, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I wanted to speak with you about the media attention this incident has garnered." Marcus sat, his back straight, his face expressionless. "I'm aware of the coverage, sir." Captain Price gave a small nod, as if acknowledging Marcus's resilience. "I understand this situation has been difficult, but I want you to know that the palace remains supportive of your position. The inquiry cleared you of any wrongdoing, and your record here speaks for itself." Marcus felt a flicker of relief, though he knew the worst was not yet over. That said, Captain Price continued, his voice measured. "The media has latched onto this story, and the situation has become sensitive. There have been calls for us to address the incident in a way that satisfies public concern." A sense of dread settled over Marcus. "What does that mean, sir?" Captain Price sighed, his expression conflicted. "It means there is talk of temporarily reassigning you away from the palace grounds until this attention dies down." Marcus's heart sank. He had worked so hard, endured so much, to stand where he was, to wear the uniform and hold his position with pride. And now he was being asked to step aside, to give up his post, not because of anything he had done, but because of how others perceived him. "Sir, with respect," he began, his voice steady but laced with disappointment, "I've done nothing wrong. I upheld my duty." Captain Price nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Marcus's with a look that was almost apologetic. "I know, Grant. And this isn't a reflection on your performance. It's a matter of optics. The palace can't afford to have this kind of scrutiny affecting its image." The words stung, each one a reminder of the way perception could overshadow truth, of how easily his identity could be twisted to fit someone else's narrative. He had been strong, disciplined, unflinching, and yet it wasn't enough. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice firm despite the pain beneath it, "with respect, this isn't just about optics. This is about fairness. I've served this institution with everything I have, and I don't deserve to be sidelined over a false accusation." Captain Price held his gaze, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of respect in the older man's eyes. But then the captain sighed, leaning back in his chair, a look of resignation crossing his face. "I know, Grant," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "but the reality is that we have to protect the reputation of this institution. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions." Marcus sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't change the decision. The wheels were already in motion, and he was a small piece in a larger machine, one that moved with indifference to individual cost. After a long pause, Captain Price spoke again, his tone softer. "This won't be permanent. Once the attention dies down, I'll see to it that you're reinstated. In the meantime, I'm assigning you to an internal position, training and mentoring new recruits. It's a valuable role, and one that I believe you'll excel in." Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. He felt the sting of disappointment, the hollow ache of knowing he was being pushed aside. But he forced himself to nod, to accept the reality before him. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steady. Captain Price watched him for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Thank you, Sergeant Grant." Dismissed. That night, Marcus lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He felt betrayed, not just by the palace but by a world that seemed intent on forcing him into a box he didn't belong in. But as he lay there, the weight of his frustration began to lift, replaced by a new determination. If this was how things had to be, he would make the most of it. He would train new guards with the same discipline, the same resilience that had brought him this far. He would pass on his pride, his strength, his unbreakable spirit. They could move him from his post, they could reshape the story, but they couldn't take away what he had achieved, or the dignity he carried within him. And someday, he vowed, he would return to the palace, stronger and prouder than before. The transition to his new assignment was swift. Within days, Marcus was moved from his post at the palace gates to an internal training role. The reassignment felt like a demotion, a dismissal of everything he'd worked toward. Yet he knew he had no choice but to approach it with dignity. If he let his frustration show, he'd only confirm the suspicions of those who were already questioning his ability to handle his position. He arrived at the training grounds early on his first day, the morning mist clinging to the parade square as the sun rose above the barracks. His new role would be to mentor and train recruits, young men who had yet to step foot in the public eye, many of whom saw the uniform as a mere costume for tradition, not a symbol of honor and sacrifice. They were raw, their movements uncertain, but he could see the flicker of pride in their eyes, the same pride he'd once felt when he first donned the red tunic and bearskin cap. As he lined up the recruits for their first drill, he sensed their curiosity, their eyes occasionally darting to him, murmuring among themselves about the guard from the papers. He felt the weight of their questions, but he kept his gaze forward, focused. "All right, recruits," he called, his voice steady and commanding. "This is the Royal Guard. You may think you know what that means, but here, you'll learn the true meaning of service, honor, and discipline." The recruits snapped to attention, their eyes wide with a mixture of respect and apprehension. Marcus took them through the first drills, demonstrating the basic formations, the subtle adjustments to their stances, and the level of precision expected of each guard. "Every movement you make, every glance, every breath, must convey strength and control," he instructed. "The uniform you wear represents not only the palace but centuries of tradition. You stand for something greater than yourselves. Never forget that." As the morning wore on, Marcus found himself easing into his role, focusing on the recruits, pushing his own frustrations aside. He saw potential in a few of them, a young man named Henry with a quiet intensity, a woman named Sophie whose sharp focus rivaled his own. They were still unpolished, but he could see the beginnings of resilience, that inner strength he'd come to recognize over the years. He was in the middle of instructing them on posture when he caught sight of a familiar figure approaching across the square. Amelia Davis, a palace employee he had seen on occasion in the past, though they had rarely spoken. Amelia was in her early 30s, with a calm, self-assured presence. She worked in palace operations and had a reputation for her level-headedness, a rare trait in the often frenzied world of palace administration. She approached him with a slight smile, her expression soft but observant. "Sergeant Grant," she greeted, a hint of warmth in her tone. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Marcus nodded politely, though his guard remained up. He hadn't spoken much to Amelia before, and given the recent attention, he was wary of anyone approaching him with questions or judgment. "Not at all, Miss Davis," he replied, his tone formal. She studied him for a moment before glancing over at the recruits, who were now going through their paces under the watchful eye of another instructor. "They're lucky to have you as a mentor," she said, her tone genuine. "Not everyone would handle a sudden change of position with as much grace." Marcus felt a flicker of surprise. "Thank you," he said carefully, "though I imagine some would say it's just duty." Amelia tilted her head thoughtfully. "I suppose, but I think there's more to it than that. Not everyone could have handled what you've been through with such resilience. I wanted you to know that some of us see that." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. He had grown so used to being scrutinized, to being defined by the story that others had created around him, that he'd forgotten that there were people who could see past it, people who understood. "Thank you," he said again, and this time, his voice was softer, the tension in his shoulders easing just a bit. Amelia nodded, her gaze warm but respectful. "I know it's not my place to say, but I think you're setting an example for everyone here, whether they realize it or not. The palace may be steeped in tradition, but it needs people who can endure change, who can uphold its values without losing themselves." Marcus felt the weight of her words settle over him, a quiet reassurance that resonated with his own sense of purpose. In that moment, he understood that his role wasn't just about wearing the uniform or standing guard at the gates. It was about embodying the principles he'd spent years upholding, even when others doubted him. "Thank you, Miss Davis," he said, his voice steady. "It means a lot to hear that." Amelia gave him a small smile. "Of course. And if you ever need someone to talk to, well, I'm around." With that, she turned and left, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. Her words lingered, a quiet reminder that, even in the midst of this media storm, there were those who saw the truth, who respected him for the person he was, not the narrative that had been forced upon him. Over the next few weeks, Marcus poured himself into his new role, finding solace in the discipline of training. He guided the recruits through grueling drills, honing their focus and resilience. When they faltered, he pushed them to be better, instilling in them the same pride he held for the Royal Guard, even if his own position had been temporarily changed. One day, as he was instructing them on the importance of composure under pressure, he noticed one recruit, Henry, struggling with his stance, his movements tense and uncertain. Marcus approached him, his tone firm but encouraging. "Henry, focus on your breathing. You're overthinking. Remember, composure comes from within. No one can shake you if you're steady here." He tapped his chest, emphasizing the strength that came from self-assurance. Henry nodded, visibly concentrating as he adjusted his stance, the tension easing from his shoulders. Marcus watched him, seeing a younger version of himself in the recruit's determination, in the quiet pride that began to show in his posture. In those moments, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was passing on something valuable, a resilience that would serve these recruits well, both in their roles as guards and in their lives beyond the palace. His reassignment had felt like a demotion at first, but now he understood that this role was just as vital, if not more so. He was shaping the next generation, imparting to them the strength to withstand scrutiny, to uphold their dignity, even under the harshest gaze. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging training session, Marcus was heading back to his quarters when he saw a familiar face waiting near the entrance. Tommy Wainwright, Emma's nephew. The boy looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot as he clutched a small notebook in his hands. "Hello, sir," Tommy said quietly, looking up at Marcus with a mixture of shyness and admiration. Marcus felt a surge of surprise. "Tommy, what are you doing here?" The boy took a deep breath, then held out the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. I wanted to say sorry for what happened. My aunt was. I didn't know she caused so much trouble. I feel bad, and I thought maybe." His voice trailed off, his gaze dropping to the ground. Marcus looked down at the notebook, seeing the words "Thank you," Guard Marcus scrawled in a child's careful handwriting. Flipping through it, he saw drawings of palace guards, sketches of St. James Palace, and small notes of admiration scribbled next to each picture. The innocence and sincerity of it tugged at something deep inside him. "Thank you, Tommy," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "This means a lot. You know, it's not easy to apologize, especially when others don't understand." Tommy looked up, relief softening his features. "I just wanted you to know that I think you're brave. Even if Aunt Emma said things, I didn't believe her. I think you're a good guard." Marcus felt a warmth spreading through him, the kind of quiet pride he'd nearly forgotten. "Thank you, Tommy," he said, his voice steady. "And remember, standing up for what you believe in, even if it's hard, that's bravery too." Tommy nodded, his expression thoughtful, before glancing back toward the gate. "I'll come visit again someday, if that's all right." Marcus smiled. "I'd like that." As Tommy turned and walked away, Marcus held the notebook close, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This role, this path he was on, was more than just about himself. It was about showing others, young and old, that dignity and honor mattered, that resilience could carry you through even the darkest times. As he headed back to the barracks, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. He would continue to stand strong, to guide and inspire, and one day, he would return to his rightful place, carrying with him the lessons he'd learned and the strength he'd built, now more powerful than ever. The next week passed in a blur as Marcus continued his work, training the recruits with a quiet dedication that won their respect. The media frenzy had begun to die down, though the tension still lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of the battle he had faced. But Marcus pushed forward, using every challenge as fuel for his resolve. And as he trained the recruits, he felt his purpose strengthen with each passing day. Then, just as he thought things were settling, Captain Price summoned him to his office once more. Marcus couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety as he made his way to the meeting, the weight of past weeks pressing heavily on him. When he entered, Captain Price looked up from his desk, his face more serious than Marcus had seen before. A second figure sat across from the captain, a palace official in a crisp suit, his expression as unyielding as his posture. Marcus stood at attention, his face a mask of professionalism. "Sergeant Grant," Captain Price said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "This is Mr. Aldridge from the Ministry of Defense. He's here to conduct a final inquiry related to the recent incident." Marcus sat down slowly, a storm of emotions swirling beneath his composed exterior. The inquiry. He thought he'd been cleared, that the incident had been put to rest. But the Ministry of Defense's presence signaled that this was far from over. Mr. Aldridge looked at Marcus with a detached professionalism that was almost unsettling. "Sergeant Grant," he began, his tone clipped and efficient, "thank you for joining us. As you know, the palace has been under considerable scrutiny regarding recent events. The inquiry we're conducting today will give you an opportunity to clarify any remaining questions surrounding your conduct." Marcus nodded, though he felt the familiar tension return, tightening his muscles and sharpening his focus. He had been through countless drills, faced tough questions before, but he knew this was different. Here, every word mattered. Mr. Aldridge opened a slim folder and scanned the documents within, his gaze cold and impassive. "The issue we must address is this. While no official misconduct was noted, there were reports indicating that your behavior, specifically your expression and perceived demeanor, may have been intimidating to the complainant." Marcus fought the impulse to react, keeping his expression steady as he replied, "With all due respect, sir, I stood at attention the entire time. I didn't speak or break my position." Mr. Aldridge nodded, his tone unwavering. "That may be true, Sergeant, but as a representative of the Royal Guard, your presence is as much a part of this institution as the palace itself. Perception plays a significant role in public relations, particularly in an organization as visible as yours." The words hung in the air, the unspoken accusation as heavy as the silence that followed. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, a mixture of frustration and disbelief swirling within him. He knew the rules, knew how to maintain the poise demanded of him. But now, it seemed even his silence had been twisted, his presence contorted to fit someone else's story. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice steady but tinged with controlled frustration, "I was trained to remain unresponsive under any provocation, to uphold my position without engaging. That's exactly what I did." Mr. Aldridge raised an eyebrow, his gaze unrelenting. "And yet, the media coverage suggests otherwise. The perception, whether accurate or not, was that you reacted in a way that could be construed as confrontational." Captain Price cleared his throat, his gaze shifting to Marcus with something close to sympathy. "We know the truth, Sergeant. However, we must consider the impact on public opinion, particularly given the visibility of the Royal Guard." The words stung, each one a reminder that the truth, in this world, wasn't always enough. Perception was a powerful weapon, one that had turned his disciplined silence into a so-called intimidation tactic. Mr. Aldridge continued, his voice cold. "There is one further issue to address. We have received feedback from a few colleagues regarding your demeanor since the incident. Some have noted a change." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd worked so hard to remain composed, to uphold his duties, yet now even his own colleagues seemed to doubt him. "Sir, if I may," he said, his voice steady, "the past few weeks have been challenging, but I assure you, my commitment to the Royal Guard has never wavered. I have upheld my duties and performed them with the same dedication as I have from day one." Mr. Aldridge regarded him with a measured look. "Very well, Sergeant. I'd like to give you the opportunity to state, in your own words, what this role means to you. The significance you see in serving as a guard at the palace." Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he spoke, his words clear and deliberate. "Serving as a royal guard isn't just a job to me. It's a calling. Every day, I stand in uniform, representing not just the palace but the history, tradition, and pride of this nation. And as one of the few blackguards, I know my presence holds a deeper significance. I have worked hard, harder than some might realize, to uphold this tradition with respect and discipline. To be here means more than simply wearing the uniform. It means showing others that this institution belongs to everyone." Captain Price's face softened, though Mr. Aldridge remained impassive, closing the folder and regarding Marcus with the same detached scrutiny. After a moment, Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat. "Thank you, Sergeant Grant. The Ministry will consider your statement in our final assessment. Until then, we ask that you continue in your current duties." Marcus felt a rush of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that his position remained precarious, that he was still under a shadow cast by someone else's narrative. But he nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Yes, sir." The days that followed were tense as Marcus waited for news, each shift tinged with the uncertainty of what might come next. But he didn't let it break his focus. He kept training the recruits, drilling them with the same intensity, the same pride that he'd carried through his own journey. He could see the respect in their eyes, felt the camaraderie beginning to form as they grew to understand the discipline and honor he represented. One evening, as he was finishing a drill, he noticed Henry, the young recruit who had struggled with his stance, approaching him, his expression thoughtful. "Sergeant Grant," Henry began, his tone respectful, "I just wanted to say, I admire how you've handled everything. I know some people don't get it, but we do. We know what you're going through, and we're proud to have you training us." The words struck a chord deep within Marcus, a warmth spreading through him as he realized that, despite everything, he had made a difference. He had stood his ground, and the recruits saw that. They understood. "Thank you, Henry," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "And remember, strength isn't just about standing tall when things are easy. It's about holding steady, even when you're pushed to the limit." Henry nodded, his gaze filled with respect. "I'll remember that, sir." A few days later, Marcus was summoned back to Captain Price's office. This time, the captain was alone, his expression grave but tinged with a hint of something softer, something close to pride. "Sergeant Grant," he began, his voice steady, "the Ministry has concluded its inquiry. They've cleared you of any misconduct and have agreed to close the matter permanently." Relief flooded Marcus's chest, the tension of the past weeks finally easing. He gave a quiet nod, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir." Captain Price studied him for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You've handled yourself with honor throughout this ordeal, Grant. Few could have maintained the level of composure you showed, particularly under the scrutiny you faced." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of Captain Price's words. "Thank you, sir. I've learned that sometimes, all you can do is stay true to yourself." Captain Price gave a small nod. "Indeed. And I want you to know that the palace has recognized that. You'll be reinstated to your post as soon as you're ready." A sense of pride filled Marcus as he met Captain Price's gaze, the knowledge that he had weathered the storm and come through stronger than ever filling him with a quiet confidence. As he left the office, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, a strength that was not simply born of resilience but forged in the fires of adversity. He had endured, held true to his values, and come out the other side. And as he walked through the palace grounds, the familiar sights and sounds filling him with a sense of home, he knew that his journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one in which he would continue to stand as a symbol of strength, pride, and resilience, for himself and for everyone watching. Marcus returned to his post with his head held high, the weight of his uniform a reminder of the legacy he now carried forward. He was here to stay, and he would stand tall, stronger than ever, for all to see. A week after Marcus was reinstated to his post, he finally felt a sense of calm return to his life. Standing tall once more at the palace gates, he was reminded of how much he had missed this duty, this ritual of representing the royal guard and the honor it carried. His pride had been shaken but not broken, and now, more than ever, he was determined to carry on his role with renewed dignity. The crowd that gathered daily seemed more respectful now, almost reverent. There was a palpable shift in the way they looked at him, as if his resilience had earned him not only admiration but a deeper respect. His story had spread in ways he couldn't control, but it had also inspired a quiet, subtle appreciation among the visitors and even among some of his fellow guards. Then one day, during his break, he spotted a small figure waiting near the palace entrance. It was a boy, clutching a notebook and staring intently at the guards. Marcus felt a pang of recognition. It was Tommy Wainwright, Emma's young nephew. Tommy glanced up and caught Marcus's gaze, his face a mixture of determination and anxiety. He took a few tentative steps forward before Marcus gave him a small nod, signaling it was all right for him to approach. The boy's face lit up with relief, and he hurried over, clutching the notebook tightly to his chest. "Hello, sir," Tommy said, his voice timid but polite. "Hello, Tommy," Marcus replied, his tone calm but curious. He hadn't expected to see the boy again, especially not here at the palace. Tommy hesitated, looking down at his notebook, before finally gathering the courage to speak. "I wanted to come see you because I wanted to say I'm sorry. About what happened." Marcus's expression softened, but he remained silent, letting Tommy find his words. "My aunt, she told me that you were a bad guard, and that you didn't belong here," Tommy continued, his voice trembling slightly. "At first, I believed her, but after she left, I felt bad. I didn't understand why she was so mean to you, and I wanted to tell you that I don't think like her. I don't think it was fair." The boy's admission took Marcus by surprise, and a warmth spread through him as he looked at Tommy, seeing the sincerity in his wide eyes. It took courage to apologize, especially for something so complex that even many adults struggle to understand. Marcus knew how important this moment was for the boy, how it could shape his understanding of the world. "Thank you, Tommy," Marcus said, his voice steady. "It takes courage to apologize, and it's not easy to understand things when others don't explain them to you. I respect you for coming here." Tommy glanced up, visibly relieved. "I drew you something," he said, his cheeks flushing slightly as he handed Marcus the notebook. Marcus opened it, revealing a series of drawings. Some were rough sketches of the palace, but others showed the guards in their uniforms, standing tall at their posts. In one of the drawings, a guard stood alone, his figure shaded with a darker pencil, his head held high and his stance unshakable. "That's you," Tommy said, pointing to the drawing. "I wanted to show you how I see you. You're strong, like a statue, but you're also kind and brave." Marcus felt a pang of emotion at the boy's words. He had spent years perfecting his stance, his composure, his ability to remain unmoved. But he'd always hoped that beneath the surface, people would see the person behind the uniform, the pride he took in his duty, the determination to rise above the prejudice he sometimes faced. And here, in a child's drawing, he saw a reflection of that hope. "Thank you, Tommy," he said, his voice soft. "This means a lot to me." Tommy's face brightened with pride. "You're welcome. I wanted you to know that I think you're one of the best guards here." Marcus chuckled softly, the warmth of the boy's words settling over him like a balm. "Well, I'm honored to hear that." Tommy hesitated, then asked, "Is it hard? Standing there all day? And not saying anything, even when people say mean things?" Marcus thought about the question, choosing his words carefully. "It can be hard," he admitted. "But being a guard isn't just about standing still. It's about standing for something bigger than yourself. When I'm here, I'm part of something important, something that's been here for hundreds of years, and that gives me strength." Tommy nodded thoughtfully, his expression filled with a newfound understanding. "I think I get it now, and I think you're really brave to keep standing there, even when people don't understand." The simplicity of Tommy's statement struck Marcus, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths came from the innocence of youth. He looked down at the boy, feeling a surge of gratitude for this small but powerful encounter. As the palace bell chimed, signaling the end of Marcus's break, he turned to Tommy. "Thank you for coming, Tommy. You've given me something I won't forget." Tommy beamed, and after a moment, he saluted, mimicking the stance he'd seen Marcus hold so many times. "Thank you, sir." Marcus smiled, saluting back. "Take care, Tommy." The boy waved and scampered back toward the palace gates, clutching his notebook, his face alight with pride. Watching him go, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him, a reminder of why he continued to stand tall, why he would keep doing so even in the face of adversity. Later that evening, Marcus reflected on the interaction, feeling a shift in himself, a quiet but significant transformation. The past weeks had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, challenging not just his patience but his very identity. Yet Tommy's apology, his drawings, and his words had reminded him of a simple truth. He was not alone. There were people who saw his resilience, who respected him not just as a guard but as a person. As he lay in his bunk, Marcus thought about the generations of guards who had come before him, the legacy they had upheld. He realized that he, too, was now part of that legacy. His journey wasn't just about duty. It was about standing as a symbol of resilience, for those like Tommy who looked to him for strength, for those who needed to see that tradition could evolve, that strength could come from both discipline and compassion. The days passed, and Marcus found himself with a renewed sense of pride in his role. Every time he took his post, he remembered Tommy's words, the quiet validation that had come from a place of innocence and sincerity. He understood that, beyond the uniform, beyond the duty, his purpose was to be a steady presence in a world that often felt unsteady. One day, as he stood at his post, he caught sight of a small crowd gathered at the gates, a group of tourists admiring the palace. In the midst of them, he spotted Tommy with a different guardian, perhaps a family member. The boy looked up at Marcus with a smile, his face alight with pride. Marcus returned a subtle nod, maintaining his composure, but feeling the warmth spread through him once more. As he stood there, a living statue against the backdrop of history, Marcus felt an unwavering confidence, a knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He would continue to stand tall, not just for himself but for everyone watching. For those like Tommy who would one day grow up in a world he hoped would be kinder, more understanding. And with that, he reaffirmed his vow, to protect, to stand strong, and to inspire, no matter the challenges that came his way. A month had passed since Marcus had been reinstated to his post, and he felt stronger, more resolute than ever. His interaction with Tommy had reminded him of the power of resilience and the silent impact he could make. Every morning, he donned his uniform with a renewed sense of pride, each step a reminder of the journey he'd endured, the trials he'd overcome, and the principles he had chosen to uphold. One evening, as Marcus was preparing to leave for the day, he received an unexpected message. He was to report to Captain Price's office. The notice was brief, almost cryptic, and he couldn't shake the unease that gripped him as he made his way to the meeting. Though the incident with Emma had quieted, he had learned to be wary of sudden summits. When he entered the office, Captain Price was seated at his desk, his expression unreadable. But there was another figure in the room, an older gentleman with silver hair and a calm, steady presence, dressed in the impeccable suit of a high-ranking official. Marcus immediately recognized him as Major General Jonathan Fields, a senior officer who oversaw the Royal Guard and rarely visited individual members. "Sergeant Grant," Captain Price began, his tone carefully formal, "this is Major General Fields. He's here to discuss a matter of importance with you." Marcus stood at attention, his posture rigid, though he could feel his heart racing. Major General Fields nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his gaze steady as he regarded Marcus. "At ease, Sergeant," Fields said, his voice firm but warm. "I've heard quite a bit about you over the past few months." Marcus relaxed slightly but maintained a professional stance, waiting for the Major General to continue. Fields studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp and discerning. "I am aware of the challenges you have faced recently," he said, his tone even. "Your dedication, your perseverance, and your ability to stand tall under difficult circumstances have not gone unnoticed." Marcus felt a surge of surprise, but he kept his expression neutral. Praise from a senior officer like Major General Fields was rare, and the words struck a deep chord within him. For so long, he had felt isolated, as though his efforts had been quietly dismissed or overlooked. To hear his resilience acknowledged in such a formal setting was a validation he hadn't anticipated. "The institution you represent is one with a long, unbroken history," Fields continued, his gaze steady, "and it has always valued tradition. However, tradition alone cannot carry us forward. We must adapt to changing times, and part of that adaptation is embracing the diversity and strength of individuals like yourself." Marcus felt a faint sense of relief, but he was also cautious. These words, though powerful, had been few and far between in his journey. "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, keeping his tone respectful but grateful. Major General Fields nodded. As you know, the palace has faced a great deal of scrutiny in recent months due to the incident you were involved in. It has stirred conversations that extend beyond this single event, and it has raised questions about how we as an institution address diversity and inclusion within the Guard. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken. These were words he hadn't expected to hear, not from someone so senior, so entrenched in the traditions of the Royal Guard. And yet, here they were, spoken plainly, without hesitation. To that end, Fields continued, we've decided to create a new position within the Royal Guard, one that will oversee the training and development of all new recruits with an emphasis on cultural awareness, inclusivity, and resilience under pressure. We believe that by setting a higher standard in these areas, we can strengthen the institution as a whole. The Major General paused, looking directly at Marcus. And we would like you to lead this initiative, Sergeant Grant. The words hung in the air, settling over Marcus like a revelation. He felt a wave of disbelief, quickly followed by a surge of pride and an unexpected humility. This was more than a promotion. It was a chance to shape the future of the Royal Guard, to ensure that every recruit would feel respected, understood, and supported in a way he hadn't always been. Sir, Marcus said, steadying his voice, I'm honored by your confidence in me. I didn't expect this. Fields's eyes softened slightly. Few would have shown the resilience you did, Sergeant. This role requires someone who can lead by example, someone who can teach not just the traditions of the Royal Guard, but the principles of respect, dignity, and fortitude that are often tested but rarely spoken about. Captain Price spoke up, his expression one of approval and respect. Sergeant Grant, your journey hasn't been easy, but you've earned the respect of your peers, of the recruits, and of this institution. This role is an opportunity to help us grow stronger, to ensure that the Royal Guard remains both a symbol of tradition and a beacon of progress. Marcus felt the weight of their words, the enormity of the responsibility settling over him. He thought back to Tommy's innocent apology, the boys' understanding and admiration, and the recruits who looked to him for guidance. This role was a chance to create an environment where the next generation of guards wouldn't face the same challenges he had, where they would feel not just part of the institution but an essential part of its evolution. I accept, sir, Marcus said, his voice filled with conviction. I'll do everything I can to honor this role and make a difference. Fields nodded approvingly. Excellent, Sergeant. We will formally announce your promotion at the next ceremony. In the meantime, I'd like you to begin meeting with the current recruits and preparing a curriculum that emphasizes the values we discussed. Marcus felt a surge of energy, a drive he hadn't felt since he'd first joined the Guard. Yes, sir. I'll begin immediately. The following days were a whirlwind as Marcus began his new duties. He met with the recruits, held workshops on resilience and composure, and shared insights on handling the challenges that came with the uniform. He taught them not only how to stand at attention but how to carry themselves with dignity, no matter who stood before them or what words were thrown their way. He introduced sessions on empathy and understanding, showing recruits how to see the value in each person's story. He knew the institution's traditions were powerful, but he also knew that true strength came from recognizing and respecting diversity within that tradition. Henry and Sophie, two of the recruits he had mentored previously, were particularly inspired. They approached him after a session on the importance of upholding dignity under scrutiny. Sergeant Grant, Henry said, his voice filled with admiration, I just wanted to say thank you. I never understood what it meant to really stand for something until I saw what you went through and how you came out of it. You're more than a guard to us. You're an example. Marcus felt a warmth in his chest, a confirmation that he was on the right path. Thank you, Henry. And remember, being a guard is more than wearing a uniform. It's about carrying your principles with you, standing tall even when it's hard. On the day of his formal promotion, the palace held a special ceremony, attended by guards, officials, and palace staff. Major General Fields presented him with a special commendation, formally recognizing his new role as the head of training and development. The commendation acknowledged his resilience, his dedication, and his embodiment of the values the Royal Guard aspired to uphold. As he stood before the gathered crowd, Marcus felt a profound sense of pride. He had started as a symbol of tradition, a silent figure at the palace gates. But now, he was more than that. He was a symbol of resilience, of change, and of the strength that came from unity within diversity. After the ceremony, as he mingled with the crowd, he spotted Tommy with his family, waving excitedly. Marcus gave him a nod and a subtle smile, grateful for the young boy's simple words, which had sparked a new strength within him. Later that night, Marcus stood alone by the palace gates, looking out over the grounds he had guarded for so long. The night was calm, the stars scattered across the sky, and the palace stood tall and silent behind him, a timeless testament to history. He knew his journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new battles, but he was ready. He had weathered the storm, faced down prejudice, and emerged not only as a guard but as a leader, a mentor, and a symbol of strength. As he stood there, he felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet pride that filled him to his core. This was where he belonged, standing tall, carrying forward the legacy of the Royal Guard while helping to shape its future. Marcus Grant was ready for whatever came next, and with every step he took, he carried with him the knowledge that he was more than a symbol. He was a force for change, a testament to resilience, and a guardian of honor, standing proudly in a tradition he had helped make his own. The following weeks were some of the most fulfilling of Marcus's career. His new position as the head of training and development brought unexpected challenges, but he faced them with the same resilience and dedication that had carried him through so much already. He spent each day working closely with the new recruits, overseeing their progress, and guiding them through the rigorous drills and principles that made the Royal Guard both an institution of tradition and a force of unyielding discipline. As Marcus drilled them in the timeless practices of posture and parade, he found himself weaving in lessons on resilience and respect, concepts that weren't part of the official curriculum but, he believed, were essential to their success. Under his guidance, the recruits didn't just learn how to stand tall. They learned how to carry their pride, to respect one another's strengths and struggles, and to find common purpose in a role that was larger than any one of them. One afternoon, Marcus gathered the group of recruits in a quiet training hall. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm beams across the polished floor, and the recruits sat attentively as he shared his story. Not the version they had heard through the news or rumors, but his own, spoken simply and without bitterness. He told them about his journey, the challenges he'd faced, and the pride he'd found in serving despite it all. Standing here, in this uniform, it's a privilege, he said, his voice carrying across the hall. But it's also a responsibility. You're here to protect more than just a building. You're here to uphold values, dignity, resilience, and respect. And that respect starts here, with each other. When you look to your left and right, remember you're standing with people who will one day trust you to have their back. The recruits were silent, listening with intensity. He could see the weight of his words settling on them, the understanding that they were part of something much larger than themselves. After the session, Sophie, a young recruit with sharp focus and determination, approached him. "Sergeant Grant," she began, her tone hesitant but sincere, "I just want to say, it's inspiring to know that someone like you went through all of that and didn't give up. I think we all look up to you." Her words stirred something deep in Marcus. He hadn't set out to be a role model, but seeing the way the recruits looked at him now, he realized that his struggles had a purpose beyond himself. His journey, as challenging as it had been, was now a part of their education. His resilience had become a source of strength not only for himself, but for those who looked up to him. "Thank you, Sophie," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Remember that the strength you need to be a guard, it's already within you. It just takes patience and dedication to bring it out." As Marcus settled into his new role, he began to notice changes among his peers as well. Some of the more senior guards, who had once treated him with reserved indifference, now looked to him with respect. They came to him with questions, asking his thoughts on matters of discipline and how best to handle the rigors of the role. He was no longer just one of them. He was a leader among them. One day, during a break between training sessions, Captain Price found him in the courtyard. The captain's gaze was thoughtful as he regarded Marcus, and after a moment, he spoke. "Sergeant Grant," he said, his tone softer than usual, "I wanted to commend you on your work with the recruits. I've been hearing good things about the changes you've brought to the program. It's made an impression, not just on them but on the entire regiment." Marcus nodded, the gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. I've tried to bring something new, something that will help them understand the value of what we do here." Captain Price paused, then gave him a slight nod. "I think you've succeeded. I hope you understand that this evolution of the Guard, it's needed. Your approach is something we haven't had before, and it's making us stronger." Hearing this from Captain Price, a man who had always held to the traditions and values of the Guard with such rigor, felt like the completion of a journey. Marcus realized that he was no longer an outsider fighting to be recognized. He had, in his own way, become a respected part of the institution. "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, his voice filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing his work was valued. "I'll do everything I can to continue making a positive impact." Captain Price nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I have no doubt of that, Grant. Keep up the good work." One afternoon, during a break in training, Marcus spotted Tommy standing outside the gates of the palace, clutching his notebook with a look of determination. The boy waved excitedly when he caught Marcus's eye, and Marcus felt a warmth spread through him as he signaled for Tommy to approach. "Hello, Tommy," he greeted, his tone welcoming. "Good to see you again." Tommy's face lit up, and he practically bounced on his feet. "Hello, Sergeant Grant. I wanted to show you something." He handed Marcus the notebook, which was now filled with drawings of the palace guards, each sketched with detail and care. In one drawing, Marcus stood at attention, his posture unwavering, a look of determination on his face. It was a simple drawing, but something about it captured the strength and dignity he strove to embody every day. "I've been drawing you, practicing," Tommy explained, his eyes shining. "I think one day, I want to be like you. I want to be a guard." The sincerity in Tommy's voice moved Marcus in a way he hadn't expected. In that moment, he saw himself in the young boy, an innocent desire to stand for something meaningful, a yearning to be part of something greater. "Thank you, Tommy," Marcus replied, his voice gentle. "You know, being a guard isn't just about wearing a uniform. It's about protecting what you believe in, standing up for others, and showing respect to everyone, no matter who they are." Tommy nodded, his expression serious. "I'll remember that." Marcus rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving him a proud nod. "And if you work hard and hold on to those values, I have no doubt you'll make a great guard someday." That evening, as Marcus reflected on the day, he realized that his role had come full circle. He had started as a guard, driven by the desire to prove himself, to make a place for himself in a world that hadn't always welcomed him. Now, he was more than just a symbol. He was a mentor, a guide, and a model for the next generation of guards. He understood that the future of the Royal Guard would be built not just on tradition, but on values of inclusivity and resilience. He would continue to shape that future, ensuring that those who came after him would find an environment where they were respected, where they could grow without fear of prejudice or misunderstanding. In his own journey, he had found strength he hadn't known he possessed, and now he could pass that strength on. His story would be their foundation, a legacy of resilience and honor that would endure beyond the palace walls. The next morning, as Marcus took his place at the gates, he stood with a sense of peace and purpose he hadn't felt before. He was no longer fighting for recognition or respect. He had earned it, and he had become a part of the Royal Guard's evolving history. The tourists gathered as always, their eyes filled with admiration, and the recruits watched him with the awe he had once felt himself. In their gaze, he saw the impact he had made, the values he had instilled, and he knew that his legacy would live on in their determination. As the palace bells chimed, marking the beginning of another day, Marcus stood tall, a silent guardian of history, dignity, and progress. And in that moment, he knew that he had found his place, not just as a royal guard, but as a leader, a mentor, and an enduring symbol of resilience. This was his story, and it would be told for years to come. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus grew more comfortable in his role as the head of training and development. Each day, he took the recruits through drills, instilling in them the values of respect, resilience, and unity. Word of his unique training approach spread throughout the palace, and soon, even the more senior guards began attending his sessions, eager to learn from his experiences and perspective. The transformation was noticeable. The recruits were no longer just trainees in uniform. They carried themselves with a newfound confidence, a sense of camaraderie, and a shared respect for one another's backgrounds and experiences. Marcus had seen them grow not just in skill but in spirit, and he knew that they were ready to take on the responsibilities that came with the uniform. One day, as Marcus was preparing for a training session, Captain Price approached him with a serious expression. "Sergeant Grant," he began, his tone respectful, "there's a special event next week, and I'd like you to be a part of it." Marcus nodded, listening intently. The palace has decided to hold an open ceremony in honor of the Guard's role in promoting unity and resilience. Captain Price continued. "It's a chance for us to recognize the values that make this institution strong, and to show the public that the Royal Guard is evolving to reflect those values." Marcus felt a surge of pride, but tempered it with curiosity. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to take part." Captain Price's expression softened. "I want you to lead the ceremony, Marcus. You'll stand before the crowd and share your journey, your experiences, and what you've learned. It's time the public sees not just the uniform, but the person behind it, the strength, the integrity, and the dedication that you've shown every day." The gravity of the invitation struck Marcus deeply. Leading a ceremony of such significance was an honor he hadn't anticipated, but he recognized the importance of the moment. This would be his chance to speak not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt like an outsider, for every recruit who might face the same trials he had endured. "I accept, sir," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'll do my best to represent us." The following week, the preparations for the ceremony were in full swing. The palace grounds were transformed, with rows of seating arranged in front of a raised platform, decorated with the Union Jack and the Royal Guard's emblem. The event would be open to the public, with media present to capture the ceremony, and Marcus felt the weight of the responsibility settle over him. On the day of the ceremony, the crowd began to gather early. Families with children, local citizens, and tourists all filled the grounds, their faces a blend of excitement and curiosity. The recruits, now fully trained and ready to join the ranks of the Guard, stood in perfect formation, their pride evident in their posture. As Marcus stood behind the platform, waiting for his turn to address the crowd, he felt a familiar twinge of nerves. But he steadied himself, reminding himself that this was his story to tell. His journey had brought him here, and he was ready to share it. Captain Price took the stage first, welcoming the crowd and introducing the purpose of the ceremony. "Today, we honor the legacy of the Royal Guard," he began, his voice clear and authoritative. "We celebrate the discipline, the resilience, and the strength that have defined this institution for centuries. But today, we also recognize that strength is found in unity and that resilience is born from respect for one another." The crowd listened attentively, their eyes fixed on the captain as he continued. "It is my honor to introduce a man who embodies these values, a man whose journey has reminded us of the power of endurance, of standing tall even when faced with adversity. Sergeant Marcus Grant has served not only as a guard but as a mentor and leader, guiding our recruits with a spirit of compassion and courage. Please welcome him." As Marcus stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause, the sound carrying a warmth that filled him with confidence. He took a moment to take in the sight of the gathered faces, the rows of recruits, and the proud expressions of his colleagues. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today is a day of honor, and I'm grateful to be here with you, to share in this celebration of the values that make the Royal Guard strong." He paused, choosing his words carefully, knowing the importance of what he was about to say. "When I first joined the Guard," he continued, "I was proud of the uniform, proud to be part of something that had stood the test of time. But as the years went on, I began to see that strength doesn't come just from standing at attention or following tradition. True strength comes from standing for something bigger than ourselves, from treating each other with dignity, from respecting the unique stories we each carry." The crowd listened intently, the atmosphere quiet and focused. "My journey hasn't been easy," Marcus said, a slight tremor in his voice as he remembered the trials he had endured. "I've faced challenges that made me question my place here, moments when I felt that perhaps I didn't belong. But each time, I found the strength to keep going, not just for myself, but for those who would come after me." He glanced at the recruits, meeting their gaze with pride. And I see that same strength in all of you. Each one of you has chosen to stand here, to wear this uniform, to uphold values that go beyond duty. You represent not only tradition but the future of this institution, a future that values respect, compassion, and resilience. The recruits stood a little taller, their pride evident in their expressions, and Marcus felt a surge of hope as he continued. To the public, to everyone here, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, I want to say thank you. Thank you for believing in the Guard, for seeing that our strength lies in unity, in our shared commitment to one another. We are stronger together, and we are proud to stand as guardians of these values. A wave of applause broke out, the crowd rising to their feet, and Marcus felt a swell of emotion as he took it all in. He had stood on these grounds for years, a silent figure representing tradition. But now, he stood as more than that. He was a voice, a symbol of resilience, and a guide for those who would follow. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the recruits celebrated with their families, Marcus was approached by Major General Fields, who offered him a firm handshake. Well done, Sergeant, Fields said, his tone filled with genuine respect. You've set a powerful example for the Guard. You've shown them what it means to lead, not just with discipline, but with heart. Thank you, sir, Marcus replied, the gratitude evident in his voice. Fields nodded. You've changed this institution for the better, Marcus. The recruits will carry your lessons forward, and so will we. As the Major General walked away, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had not only served the Guard, he had helped it grow, helped it become something stronger, something kinder. Later, as the sun set over the palace, Marcus walked the familiar grounds, his steps measured and steady. He thought back to all he had endured, the taunts, the moments of doubt, the battles he had fought, both within himself and against the world around him. Every challenge had brought him here, to this place of quiet strength. He saw Tommy standing near the gates with his family, waving at him with enthusiasm. Marcus walked over, giving the boy a nod, his smile filled with warmth. You were amazing up there, Sergeant Grant, Tommy said, his face lit up with admiration. I want to be just like you. Marcus knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, placing a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, Tommy. And remember, it's not just about wearing the uniform. It's about standing for something, kindness, respect, and strength. If you remember those things, you'll be a great Guard. Tommy nodded eagerly, his eyes bright with determination. As Marcus stood, watching Tommy walk away with his family, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a knowledge that he had left a lasting impact not only on the Guard but on the lives he had touched along the way. And as the evening descended over the palace, Marcus took his place one last time at the gates, a silent but enduring figure, the weight of history and hope resting on his shoulders. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing he had made his mark. For years to come, his story would inspire others to serve with pride, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to lead with compassion. Marcus Grant, once a silent symbol of tradition, had become a voice for the future, a future built on resilience, honor, and unity. Months had passed since the ceremony, and Marcus had settled fully into his role. His approach to training had not only reshaped the recruits' experience, but also inspired a shift across the Royal Guard. His guidance fostered a renewed sense of camaraderie and strength, infusing the institution with resilience, empathy, and unity. For Marcus, this transformation had become the culmination of years of service, sacrifice, and personal growth. On a crisp autumn morning, Marcus arrived at the palace for a new intake of recruits. There was a certain pride in seeing fresh faces, young and eager, standing where he once had, ready to embark on a journey of discipline and self-discovery. He saw them exchanging nervous glances, adjusting their stiff uniforms, their expressions a blend of excitement and uncertainty. One of the new recruits, a young woman with dark eyes and an air of quiet strength, caught his attention. She held herself with calm confidence, though her gaze carried a hint of worry. Marcus walked over, offering a reassuring nod. First day can be intimidating, he said, his voice warm. But remember, you're here because you've earned it. Trust yourself. The recruit nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, sir. I've read about what you've done for the Guard. It's an honor to be here, to learn from you." Marcus nodded, humbled yet proud. "This uniform represents something greater than any one of us. Wear it with respect and remember, you're part of a tradition, but you're also part of its evolution." As he moved on, the sense of responsibility weighed lightly on his shoulders, no longer a burden but a privilege. These recruits were part of the legacy he was helping to shape, and he would continue to stand by them, guiding them with the same patience and purpose that had brought him this far. As the months went on, Marcus became more than a mentor to the recruits. He was a trusted advisor, a leader, and a steady presence. His story had become a source of strength for them, a reminder of resilience in the face of adversity. He watched with quiet pride as they grew, each day bringing them closer to the confident, disciplined soldiers he knew they would become. One afternoon, after training had concluded, Marcus found himself at the palace gates, a place that had once felt so isolating but now felt like home. He stood in quiet reflection, looking out over the grounds, the familiar sight a reminder of how far he had come. As he stood there, he heard a voice call out from the crowd, a voice he recognized. Sergeant Grant. It was Tommy, now taller, with the beginnings of a young man's confidence. He was accompanied by his parents, who watched him with pride. Marcus smiled as the boy approached, clutching a worn sketchbook, the same one he had shown Marcus months ago, now filled with drawings, notes, and observations. Tommy's face was filled with determination, his gaze steady as he looked up at Marcus. "Hello, Tommy," Marcus greeted, his voice warm. "It's good to see you." Tommy grinned, flipping open the sketchbook to a new drawing. This time, it showed a guard standing with both strength and kindness, a perfect representation of the lessons Marcus had instilled in him. "I've been practicing," Tommy said, his voice filled with pride. "I've been thinking a lot about what you taught me, about standing for something bigger than yourself." Marcus felt a swell of pride as he looked at the drawing, seeing not just a young artist but a future leader, someone who understood the deeper meaning behind the uniform. "I'm glad to hear that, Tommy," he replied, his voice gentle. "And I want you to remember this. Strength isn't just about standing tall. It's about holding true to your values, even when it's hard. And if you keep those values close, you'll go far." Tommy nodded, his eyes shining with understanding. "I'll remember that. Thank you, Sergeant Grant." As Tommy rejoined his family, Marcus watched him go, knowing that the boy would carry the lessons forward, just as he had once carried the weight of his own journey. He had become more than a symbol for the Guard. He was now part of a legacy of resilience and dignity that would live on through Tommy and countless others who would follow. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued his work, feeling more fulfilled than ever. He had found peace in his purpose, a sense of belonging that extended beyond tradition or duty. He knew that his journey had been a part of something larger, a story that had shaped him and that would now shape others. One evening, as the sun set over the palace grounds, casting golden light across the stone walls, Marcus took his place at the gates. The tourists gathered, as they always did, but this time their gazes held admiration, respect, a silent acknowledgement of the journey he had taken. He stood there, a figure of strength and integrity, a quiet but unbreakable testament to resilience. He was no longer just a guard standing in silence. He was a guardian of values, a leader who had transformed his trials into lessons, his hardships into hope. And as the palace bells chimed in the dusk, Marcus knew that he had found his place, not just as a royal guard but as a symbol of the power of standing tall, of enduring with dignity, and of leading with compassion. This was his legacy, and it would live on long after he was gone, in the hearts of those he had touched, in the stories they would tell, and in the strength they would carry forward. In that moment, as he stood before the palace, he felt a profound peace, knowing that he had not only honored the past but had also helped to shape the future. Marcus Grant had become more than a guard. He was a part of the living legacy of the Royal Guard, a legacy built on resilience, unity, and a courage that would endure forever.